dry, lifeless stick, suddenly covered in flowers, buds, and even ripe almonds. Sounds impossible? It happened, right there, in front of everyone's eyes. But here's the real question. Was it a supernatural miracle, or just a symbolic lesson? Today, we dive deep into one of the most shocking moments recorded in the Bible, when God himself made Aaron's staff bloom as a public sign of his chosen leader. This wasn't some private vision or quiet whisper. It was a bold, undeniable demonstration of divine authority. Imagine the tension. The people were questioning Moses and Aaron, doubting their leadership, demanding proof. And God answered, not with words, but with life sprouting from dead wood. But this story goes way beyond ancient history. What happened with Aaron's staff wasn't just about the past. It reveals how God confirms his chosen ones even today, how life can emerge where there's only death, and how this moment points directly to the eternal priesthood of Christ himself. If you've ever wondered how God proves his authority, if you've questioned whether spiritual leadership is man-made or heaven-sent, stay right here, because what you're about to hear will change the way you see this story, and possibly your life. A lifeless piece of wood, stripped from the tree, dried by the desert air, forgotten in the hands of a man. That's all it was, a simple staff, a stick. But in the right moment, that staff would shake an entire nation and force thousands of skeptical eyes to confront something they couldn't deny. Because when God decides to prove a point, he doesn't do it quietly, and he certainly doesn't leave room for debate. Let me take you back to that moment. Picture this. The people of Israel are restless, frustrated, and full of doubt. They've been wandering the wilderness, and now, even the leadership God himself put in place is under attack. The rebellion didn't start with swords or armies. It started with words, the most dangerous kind of weapon when people's faith starts to crack. A man named Korah, from the tribe of Levi, steps forward, and he's not alone. He's backed by 250 well-known leaders from the community, men of influence, respected by the people. And what do they say? It's not an outright rebellion at first. It's dressed up as concern. They challenge Moses and Aaron, saying, "You've gone too far. The whole community is holy, every one of us, and the Lord is with us. So why do you set yourselves above the Lord's assembly?" Sounds reasonable on the surface, doesn't it? That's how rebellion works. It starts by twisting truth, mixing pride with half-facts, and selling it as justice. But underneath it all is jealousy. Korah and his men didn't want equality, they wanted power. They couldn't accept that God had chosen Moses to lead and Aaron to serve as high priest. And here's where the tension explodes. The camp is divided. Doubt spreads like wildfire. People are whispering, maybe Korah's right. Maybe Moses and Aaron took this authority for themselves. Maybe they're just two men like the rest of us. That atmosphere of uncertainty, it's dangerous. Because once people question who God has chosen, chaos follows. But here's the thing. God doesn't sit back and watch rebellion grow unchecked. He acts. And when he does, he leaves no room for confusion. This is when the story takes a turn no one expected. God tells Moses to gather the leaders, one from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. Each man is to bring a staff, a shepherd's staff, the symbol of leadership, authority, and responsibility. 12 staffs, all similar, all made of dry wood, lifeless, ordinary, unremarkable. But here's the detail most people miss. The staff of a leader represented more than just authority. It symbolized their calling, their divine purpose to guide, protect, and carry the people through the wilderness. These staffs had history. They were tools in battles. They supported weary hands. They pointed the way forward. Yet now, they would become the instruments through which God himself would answer the rebellion. So Moses gathers the staffs, one for each tribe, each leader engraving his name on his own. No confusion, no tricks. Everyone would know which staff belonged to whom. Among them, Aaron's staff, already questioned by many, already the target of jealousy, was laid down beside the others. And then came the silence. The staffs were placed inside the tabernacle, the sacred space where God's presence dwelled. And with that, the test began. Think about this moment. The entire nation is watching, holding their breath. Doubts, pride, ambition, all of it hangs in the air. For them, this wasn't just about a piece of wood. It was about legitimacy, about knowing, once and for all, who truly carried the authority of God. Night falls. The camp is quiet, but the tension is unbearable. Leaders wonder if tomorrow they'll rise as the new high priest. Others fear the consequences if they're wrong. But no one can deny something significant is about to happen. And here's the hook. God doesn't operate in uncertainty. He doesn't play games with leadership. When he calls someone, he confirms it in a way that leaves no doubt. The next morning, as the sun breaks the horizon, the people gather. Moses walks into the tabernacle, and what he finds isn't just unexpected, it's impossible by human standards. Aaron's staff, the same dry, lifeless stick that went in with the others, is now bursting with life. Not just buds, not just flowers, but full, ripe almonds hanging from its branches. Overnight, that dead wood had gone through every stage of growth. Something that takes seasons happened in hours. And here's where the crowd falls silent. Every man can see his own staff, unchanged, dead, ordinary. But Aaron's, it defies logic. It exposes the lie of rebellion. God's message is clear. Aaron is my chosen priest. His authority doesn't come from popularity or ambition. It comes from me. But pause for a second. Ask yourself, why almonds? Why flowers? Why this specific sign? This wasn't random. In Hebrew culture, the almond tree was known as the watchful tree. It's the first to bloom after winter, a symbol of awakening, vigilance, and new beginnings. So when God chose to make almonds grow on Aaron's staff, he wasn't just showing off power. He was declaring a new season of divine order, authority, and life where there had been death. The rebellion of Korah wasn't just crushed, it was silenced by undeniable proof. And for every man, woman, and child watching, The message burned into their memory. When God appoints someone, He authenticates them. Not with empty words, but with signs no man can replicate. But here's the real tension, the part that keeps people glued to this story. Because as shocking as the miracle was, it wasn't just about Aaron. It pointed to something, or rather someone far greater. A high priest not just for a moment, but for eternity. And that's exactly where this story leads. But before we get there, stay with me. Because what happens next unlocks the deeper layers of what this miracle means for your life today. When you hear about a dead stick suddenly blooming with life, flowers, buds, even fruit, it's easy to focus on the shock factor. But if you stop there, you miss the depth of what really happened with Aaron's staff. That wasn't just a random miracle to settle an argument. It was a message, layered with meaning. God doesn't do things for entertainment. Every detail in this story speaks volumes, especially when you understand the brutal reality the people were living in at that moment. The staff itself was no ordinary object. It represented leadership, responsibility, and in Aaron's case, divine calling. But don't romanticize it. This was a dry, weathered piece of wood, lifeless, cut off from its source. Think about that. It had been stripped from the tree, shaped into a tool, and carried for who knows how many years through the wilderness. Exposed to heat, wind, and dust. Reduced to nothing more than a symbol of authority. Respected, yes, but biologically dead. That dead wood is critical to the whole story, because what happened next wasn't natural, it wasn't gradual, and it wasn't explainable by any scientific process. In a single night, under God's command, that lifeless staff produced buds, flowers, and ripe almonds. All at once, overnight. Not one stage at a time like we see in nature, but instantly. You can't fake that. You can't argue with that. It wasn't a coincidence. It was God's deliberate statement in front of an entire nation filled with doubters. But here's the part that demands your attention. Why did God choose a dead staff to bring forth life? Why not fire from the sky? Why not thunder or lightning? He's used those before to make his point. But this time, he chose something more subtle, but far more symbolic. A lifeless object suddenly bursting with undeniable, visible, fruitful life. Because the rebellion wasn't just about political power, it was about spiritual authority. The people weren't questioning Moses and Aaron's leadership skills. They were questioning whether God himself had truly chosen them. And when people lose sight of who holds divine authority, everything collapses. Order, unity, faith. That's why this miracle wasn't just for Aaron's reputation, it was for the soul of the entire nation. A dead stick coming back to life in front of thousands of witnesses was God's way of saying, when I appoint someone, life follows, growth follows, evidence follows. But there's more to it than that, especially when you understand the deeper meaning behind those flowers and almonds. You see, the almond tree holds powerful symbolism in the Bible. It's known as the first tree to awaken from winter. While everything else still looks dead, the almond tree starts to bloom, announcing that a new season has begun. It's called the watchful tree for a reason. It represents vigilance, new beginnings, and the certainty of God's promises coming to life, even when everything else feels stagnant or hopeless. So when God made almonds grow on Aaron's staff, it wasn't random. It was deliberate, calculated, and rich with meaning. He was telling the people, "You may see death, you may see emptiness, you may believe nothing good can come from this. But I am the God who brings life where there was none. I choose, I confirm, and I produce visible fruit to silence every doubt." But let's take this even deeper, because the order in which the staff produced life matters. First, buds appeared, then flowers, then almonds. All of it miraculously in one night, but still in the proper sequence. That wasn't just for aesthetics. It revealed how God operates. Even in miracles, there's process, there's order. Buds come before flowers. Flowers come before fruit. Some of you listening right now need to hear that, because you're stuck between stages. You want fruit, you want results, but you're ignoring the process, the evidence that life is already happening, even if the final outcome isn't fully visible yet. And here's where it gets personal. Maybe your situation feels like Aaron's staff before the miracle, cut off, dry, lifeless, stripped of potential. Maybe people around you have written you off, saying there's no future, no purpose, no way forward. That's exactly the kind of situation where God steps in to show his authority, because he doesn't need perfect conditions to produce life. He doesn't ask for votes or approval. When he chooses someone, when he ordains a purpose, he brings life where no one expects it. And that brings us back to the rebellion. Korah and his followers weren't just challenging Moses and Aaron, they were challenging God's sovereignty. They disguised it as equality, but at its core, it was pride. They couldn't accept that God's calling isn't democratic. It's divine. You don't negotiate calling. You either submit to it or you resist it. And rebellion always leads to disaster. God could have crushed that rebellion with fire and judgment alone, and eventually, he did. But before that, he showed them something undeniable, a dead stick covered in life, fruit, and evidence. Because even in correction, God offers clarity. He gives people a chance to see the truth, to witness his authority not through fear alone, but through undeniable signs of life where there should be none. But this story isn't stuck in ancient history. It echoes in every moment where people question God's authority, where they demand proof, where they challenge the idea that God can bring life from dead places. And make no mistake, that challenge still exists today. People are still questioning who God has called. They're still looking at lifeless situations, doubting that anything good can come from them. But the blooming of Aaron's staff is God's answer to every skeptic, every rebel, every doubter. It's not just a history lesson. It's a living message that God authenticates his chosen ones with undeniable signs of life, growth, and fruit, no matter how impossible it seems. And the best part? that wasn't the end of the story. What happened with Aaron's staff was only a shadow, a preview of something far greater, of a priesthood far higher, and of life conquering death on a scale no one saw coming. Stay with me, because what comes next will change how you understand leadership, calling, and the power of life in the hands of the one who brings the dead back to life. 12 tribes, 12 leaders, 12 staffs. That's how God set the stage for one of the most decisive, public, and undeniable demonstrations of divine authority the people of Israel had ever seen. But what most people miss is the strategic brilliance behind this challenge. God didn't settle the rebellion with an emotional speech. He didn't crush the opposition in secret. He orchestrated a visible, undeniable test, a simple, direct challenge that left no room for arguments, no space for confusion, and no chance for manipulation. Let's break this down, because the way God set up this test reveals exactly how he deals with pride, rebellion, and spiritual arrogance. Each of the 12 tribal leaders was commanded to bring forward a staff, a shepherd's staff, the same type of tool every leader, every elder, every man of influence carried in that time. These staffs weren't decorative. They were symbols of leadership, responsibility, and authority, worn smooth by years of use, weathered by sun, sand, and storms. But now, stripped of context, those staffs were nothing more than dead sticks. Lifeless wood, cut off from its source, incapable of producing anything new. And that's exactly why God chose them as the instruments for this test, because in their natural state, those staffs had zero potential for growth. They were by definition dead. That's important. God didn't use freshly cut branches. He didn't use living trees. He used dry, finished, dead wood to prove his point. Because when God wants to reveal his authority, he does it in a way that human effort can't imitate. No manipulation, no tricks. No one could say, "Oh, Aaron planted seeds in secret," or "Someone watered the staff overnight." The staffs were dead. Everyone knew it. Everyone handled them. Every leader wrote his name on his staff in plain sight, so there would be no debate about which belonged to whom. Now picture the weight of that moment. The entire nation, hundreds of thousands of people, stood watching, waiting, doubting. Remember, the rebellion wasn't small. Korah and his followers weren't fringe radicals. They were respected leaders, men with influence, with followers, with voices that swayed the people. Their words had already cracked the unity of Israel. Their accusations poisoned the minds of the tribes. Why should Moses and Aaron lead? Aren't we all holy? Doesn't God speak through all of us? It's the same argument that's echoed through generations. Pride disguised as equality. Jealousy masked as justice. But God doesn't play by human politics. He doesn't negotiate his authority. And in this moment, he was about to settle the matter permanently. The staffs were placed inside the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, where God's presence dwelled. This wasn't just a religious space. It was the physical reminder that God was among his people, watching, listening, acting. Inside that sacred place, away from human interference, away from manipulation, the test would play out under God's direct authority. And the people waited. Imagine the tension in that camp. For years they had wandered the desert, facing hunger, thirst, and danger. Now their leadership was in question, their spiritual foundation shaken. People whispered, doubts festered. Some hoped the test would expose Moses and Aaron as frauds. Others feared the consequences of challenging God himself. And here's where the genius of the test comes in. God didn't answer with thunder or fire, at least not yet. Instead, he set a standard that required patience, observation, and trust. He allowed a full night to pass. No instant spectacle, just the quiet, heavy uncertainty of waiting for proof. But what happened inside the tabernacle that night shattered every human expectation. Aaron's staff, the same dead, dry piece of wood as the others, underwent a transformation no one could fake. It didn't just sprout a few leaves. It didn't just show signs of moisture. It produced buds, flowers, and fully mature almonds all at once, overnight. Understand the scale of that. In nature, those stages take weeks, even months. Buds emerge after the tree comes out of dormancy. Flowers bloom, then wither, making room for fruit to grow and ripen. But on Aaron's staff, every phase appeared simultaneously. That wasn't just biological, it was supernatural. A clear, calculated, and undeniable statement from God. This is my chosen leader. And yet there's another layer to this. God could have made all 12 staffs bloom to show his power, but he didn't. Only Aaron's staff produced life. The others remained dead, unchanged, untouched by divine favor. That's a hard truth, especially for men driven by pride. Because when God elevates someone, when he places his authority on an individual, it doesn't come with universal applause. It comes with clear distinction, separation, confirmation that calling is exclusive, not democratic. That reality stung for the rebels. Their staffs remained dry, lifeless, exposed as symbols of empty ambition. But Aaron's staff stood as proof that God chooses, confirms, and authenticates his leaders in ways no human can replicate. The next morning, Moses emerged with the staffs, holding visible evidence for the entire nation to see. No debates, no conspiracies. The proof was in plain sight: buds, blossoms, and fruit growing from dead wood. Think about what that did to the people's mindset. Overnight, their doubts collided with reality. They couldn't unsee it. They couldn't deny it. Rebellion lost its momentum. Pride met a wall of divine proof. But here's the part that grips you if you're paying attention. This wasn't just about ancient Israel. This moment, this miracle, set the blueprint for how God confirms his authority throughout history and in your life today. Dead situations, impossible circumstances, lifeless places where human logic says, there's no future here. That's where God moves. That's where he brings life to expose the difference between his choice and man's ambition. Some of you listening are walking through dead-end situations, dry seasons, lifeless circumstances. But remember this: When God decides to confirm his authority, he doesn't need favorable conditions. He brings life from what looks permanently dead. And just like Aaron's staff silenced the rebellion, God's work in your life silences doubt, not with arguments, but with undeniable visible results. But this is only part of the bigger picture. What happened with Aaron's staff wasn't the end of the story. It pointed forward to a greater priesthood, a higher calling, and a miracle that shattered the boundaries between life and death on an eternal scale. Stay with me, because where this story leads will completely shift how you understand authority, calling, and the unstoppable power of life in the hands of the one who holds it all. The next morning came, and with it, the moment that would shut the mouths of every doubter, silence every rebellious whisper, and settle, once and for all, the question that had divided the people. This wasn't just another sunrise. This was the day God's authority was put on display, not through speeches, not through threats, but through undeniable living proof. Moses entered the tabernacle, where the 12 staffs had been left overnight. Picture the scene, not through a modern lens of religion, but raw, unfiltered reality. These weren't decorative rods polished for a ceremony. They were rough, worn, dry pieces of wood, dead, stripped from their source, incapable of producing anything new. That's the brutal truth. And that's exactly why God chose them. Because when God moves, he chooses impossible conditions. He operates where human logic taps out, where the proud can't manipulate, where doubters can't twist the facts. And as Moses pulled out each staff one by one, the reality settled in. 11 of them looked exactly the same. Dry, lifeless, no change, no growth. The staff of Reuben, dry. The staff of Simeon, unchanged. The staff of Judah, dead. All of them, one after another, exposed for what they were. Symbols of leadership without divine backing. Representations of human ambition without God's confirmation. But then came Aaron's staff, and everything stopped. This wasn't subtle. It wasn't open to interpretation. His staff wasn't just damp or sprouting tiny leaves. It was alive, overflowing with buds, blooming with flowers, and covered in ripe almonds. Not one stage of growth. Every stage, fully developed, fully visible, all at once. You can't fake that. You can't debate that. A staff that had been dead longer than anyone cared to remember was now bursting with life that no human hand could manufacture. But let's slow down and dissect this, because every detail in that moment carried weight beyond the physical. The buds represented potential, the first visible sign that life was present, that growth had begun. The flowers symbolized beauty, the flourishing of something new, undeniable, vibrant. And the almonds, the fruit, proved maturity, completeness, evidence that what had started wasn't just a fluke. It had reached its full purpose. That sequence wasn't random. It reflected how God works, not just in ancient history, but today, in the real lives of those he calls. First comes the potential, the signs that something is shifting, even when the situation still looks impossible. Next comes the beauty, the visible flourishing of God's hand in a place others declared hopeless. And finally, the fruit, the tangible, undeniable proof that his authority produces results, not empty words. And here's where this hits home for every man listening who's ever felt stuck, doubted, or questioned the process. Maybe your life feels like one of those 11 staffs, dry, dead, lifeless, with nothing to show. Maybe your leadership, your efforts, your prayers feel pointless, ineffective, unnoticed. But the story of Aaron's staff isn't about comparison. It's about confirmation. God didn't make all 12 staffs bloom. He made one bloom, the one he chose, the one he called. Because calling isn't democratic, it's divine. You don't campaign for it. You don't manipulate your way into it. You either carry God's confirmation or you don't. That's hard for pride to swallow, but it's the truth. And it's liberating, because it removes the pressure of trying to prove yourself by human standards. When God moves, his evidence speaks louder than your words ever could. Now, think about the rebellion. Korah, Dathan, Abiram, these weren't random troublemakers. They were Levites, leaders, men with influence. They challenged Moses and Aaron not because they wanted justice, but because they wanted recognition. They couldn't stand that God's authority didn't come with equal distribution of power. But here's the trap they walked into. They confused calling with entitlement. They believed proximity to leadership qualified them for leadership. But God operates on a different level. He doesn't reward ambition. He confirms his choice through undeniable results. And in this case, he chose to display that confirmation through life bursting out of death, through almonds growing from dead wood. But why almonds? Of all things, why not grapes, figs, or olives, symbols deeply tied to Israel's identity? Because the almond tree, in Hebrew tradition, carries specific meaning. It's the first tree to awaken from winter, the first to bloom. The first to produce fruit while other trees still sleep in dormancy. God's message was precise. His authority awakens what looks dead. His timing is not tied to human cycles. He brings life ahead of schedule, on his terms, to reveal that his hand is unmistakably at work. That's why Aaron's staff didn't just sprout leaves. It exploded with every stage of life, all at once, bypassing nature's limitations. Because when God validates someone, he bypasses limitations. He accelerates growth. He silences rebellion with results. But let me press this deeper, because there's a personal layer here most men overlook. Maybe your situation looks like that barren desert the Israelites wandered for 40 years. Dry, wasted, forgotten. Maybe your faith feels stripped down, lifeless like one of those 11 dead staffs. But the message is the same. God doesn't need ideal conditions to prove his authority. He brings life from death, growth from impossible places. Evidence from the exact situation everyone wrote off. And when he does, there's no room for debate. The people didn't need a sermon. They didn't need a council meeting. They saw the staff. They saw the buds, the flowers, the fruit, and rebellion died in silence. But this story isn't done yet, because what happened with Aaron's staff wasn't the final word. It was just the foundation for a much bigger revelation, a greater priesthood, a deeper confirmation of authority. One that wouldn't just awaken Deadwood but conquer death itself. Stay with me, because where this narrative leads reshapes everything about leadership, calling, and the unstoppable power of life when it's God who brings it forth. It's easy to hear this story and only focus on the surface, the shock of a dead staff bursting with life, the undeniable proof that silenced the rebellion, the visible confirmation of Aaron's calling. But if you stop there, you miss the deeper reality, the part most people overlook. What happened with Aaron's staff wasn't just about authority. It wasn't just God picking sides. It was a statement, loud and clear, about how God works when everything looks dead, when the situation feels over, when hope is buried, and when the odds are stacked so far against you that even your own mind starts whispering, "It's done." But here's the truth. God specializes in bringing life where there's only death. And that staff, dry and lifeless one day, covered in buds, blossoms, and almonds the next, was more than a miracle. It was a symbol. A message not just for that rebellious generation in the wilderness, but for every man still walking through dry, dead seasons, wondering if anything good can come from the mess they're stuck in. Let's slow this down and strip away the religious language for a second. Imagine holding that staff, the weight of it, the dryness in your hand. You know it's dead. Everyone knows it. It's been dead for years, maybe decades. It's a tool now, not a living thing. You lean on it, guide with it, maybe defend yourself with it. But growth, life, that's impossible. And yet God took that very symbol of death, of limitation, of finality, and made it the vessel for His power. That's the pattern you see over and over again if you pay attention to how God operates. He doesn't need fresh soil, perfect conditions, or a clean track record to bring life. He chooses dead places, impossible places, because when life shows up there, no one can take the credit except Him. Look at the pattern. Throughout Scripture, God chooses what looks weak, what looks finished, what looks worthless, and uses it to make a point. A barren woman gives birth to a nation. A stuttering shepherd speaks to kings. A defeated army wins without lifting a sword. And here, a dead staff blooms in the face of rebellion. But there's a specific detail in this story that speaks volumes, the type of life God brought forth. It wasn't just green leaves or new bark, it was almonds. And in biblical culture, almonds weren't random. They were loaded with meaning. The almond tree is known as the first to awaken after winter. While everything else still looks asleep, the almond tree blooms, signaling the start of a new season before anyone expects it. It's called the watchful tree because it stays alert, ready to respond before the rest. That's not a coincidence. God didn't just pick a fruit for decoration. He chose almonds to send a message. I bring life early, ahead of schedule, in ways no one sees coming. I act before people think it's possible. And I confirm my authority when others still see nothing but death. It's no different today. Look at your own life. Maybe your situation feels cold, dormant, stuck in a never-ending winter. Maybe your marriage, your business, your purpose feels stripped down, lifeless, beyond saving. You look at your circumstances, and all you see is a dead staff, dry, brittle, impossible to fix. But the story of Aaron's staff is your reminder that God doesn't wait for perfect timing by human standards. He brings life when no one expects it, in places no one believes it can happen. And when he does, it's not partial growth. It's complete. Buds, flowers, fruit, all at once. That's how God confirms his hand. Not through empty words, not through religious posturing, but through undeniable, visible, mature evidence that silences every critic, every rebel, every doubt inside your own head. But let's not miss this. The rebellion didn't disappear instantly. Even after the staff bloomed, people still had to choose how they'd respond. That's the reality of human nature. Some will see evidence and bow in humility. Others will cling to pride, even when the facts are staring them in the face. It's the same today. You might witness God move in your life, in someone else's, and still battle voices that say, it's not real, it's not enough, it's coincidence. But the almond tree doesn't lie. The blossoms don't fake growth. The fruit doesn't appear by accident. When God confirms his authority, it's clear. Now let me push this further. The reason God used a dead staff wasn't just to show his power, it was to expose human limitations. Korah and his followers thought leadership was earned, fought for, taken by force. They believed proximity to influence meant entitlement to authority. But God doesn't operate by human politics. He chooses, he confirms, and he produces results no man can counterfeit, and the staff proves it. You can argue opinions all day. You can debate qualifications, backgrounds, charisma. But you can't argue with fruit, literal, undeniable, visible fruit growing from a place everyone called dead. That's how God shuts down rebellion. Not by overpowering people with threats, but by producing evidence that speaks louder than pride. Some of you listening need that reminder right now. You've been trying to force situations, chase recognition, prove yourself through human effort. But Aaron's staff reminds us, real authority, real leadership, real calling isn't earned. It's confirmed by God, and when he moves, the results speak for themselves. That's what silenced the rebellion. That's what settled the question. Not an argument, not a debate, but undeniable life where death used to be. And here's the real hook. The story doesn't stop with Aaron's staff. It's a foreshadowing, a preview of the ultimate demonstration of life-conquering death. A moment where, once again, God would bring undeniable, irreversible proof of his authority, not through a blooming staff, but through an empty grave. But we're not there yet. Stay locked in, because where this leads changes everything about how you see leadership, calling, and the unstoppable power of life when God's hand is on it. Here's where the story takes a turn most people don't like to talk about, but it's exactly where the truth hits the hardest. God doesn't hand out authority like a participation trophy. His authority doesn't come through popularity, seniority, or entitlement. It comes through his decision, period. And when God confirms his chosen leaders, he doesn't ask for approval. He doesn't wait for a committee. He shows up with undeniable proof that silences every debate, whether people like it or not. That's what happened with Aaron. The moment his staff bloomed, buds, blossoms, almonds, life pouring from dead wood, the conversation was over. No one could argue with that level of evidence. But here's the part that cuts deeper. The authority Aaron carried wasn't something he took for himself. It was given by God, confirmed by God, and defended by God in full view of the people. And that exposes the real tension behind the rebellion. The men challenging Moses and Aaron weren't clueless. They were Levites, familiar with the law, the structure, the system. They understood how things worked. But pride doesn't care about structure. Pride convinces men they deserve more than what they've been entrusted with. Pride disguises ambition as righteousness. It's the oldest trick in the book, and it's still working today. Korah and his followers made their move under the banner of equality. We're all holy, they said. We all have access to God. And on the surface, that sounds noble. But peel it back, and you see the truth. They weren't after unity. They were after control. They couldn't stand that authority didn't come by human effort, but by divine appointment. That's why God responded the way he did. Because when spiritual authority is under attack, when rebellion festers, God doesn't entertain arguments. He reveals the truth with power. And nothing reveals the truth more clearly than life showing up where only death existed. Let that sink in. Aaron didn't have to defend himself. He didn't have to prove his worth or argue with his critics. He laid his staff down with the others, just like God commanded. And God did the rest. Life sprouted. Growth happened. And every eye in the camp saw the evidence. That's how real authority works. It produces results without needing to shout for recognition. It speaks through undeniable fruit. You can't fake that kind of confirmation. You can't manufacture it through charisma or manipulation. But here's the brutal reality most men avoid. That kind of authority comes with accountability. It comes with responsibility, and it often comes with opposition. The moment God puts his hand on your life, the target shows up. The critics line up. The rebellion brews in the shadows. And that's why understanding where your authority comes from is critical. If you think authority is something you earn, you'll waste your energy defending it. But if you know authority is given by God, you'll stand firm, knowing He confirms His leaders with evidence no one can deny. Aaron didn't volunteer for the position of high priest. He didn't campaign for it. God chose him. And when the rebellion rose up, God defended that choice, not with empty words, but with life bursting from dead wood. But let's be real, some men will see the evidence and still rebel. That's the nature of pride. Even after the staff bloomed, even after the almonds appeared, some refused to submit. Pride blinds people to truth, even when it's staring them in the face. That's why God doesn't just confirm His authority once. He continues to produce evidence in the lives of those He calls. Fruit, growth, transformation, signs of life where death tried to reign. And the staff? It wasn't just a one-time miracle. It became a lasting reminder. God commanded Moses to place it in the Ark of the Covenant, alongside the tablets of the law and the jar of manna. Think about that. 3 symbols, side by side. The law, representing God's standard. The manna, representing His provision. And the staff, representing His authority, confirmed through life. Every time the people saw the ark, they saw that staff, a permanent reminder that God's authority produces life, and rebellion against it leads to death. This isn't ancient history. It's a pattern that still holds today. You see it in churches, in families, in businesses. Anywhere leadership exists, the tension of authority versus rebellion plays out. And the question always comes down to this: is your authority man-made, or is it God-given? Because only God-given authority produces lasting fruit. Only God-given authority survives the storms of criticism, the fires of opposition, the whispers of rebellion. And here's where it gets personal. Some of you listening right now are in positions of leadership, maybe in your home, maybe at work, maybe in ministry, and you're under fire. People questioning your role, your qualifications, your decisions. The temptation is to fight back in the flesh, to argue, to defend, to demand respect. But Aaron's story shows a better way. You lay your staff down. You let God confirm your calling. You let the evidence speak. Because when God produces life from dead places in your life, when growth shows up where everyone expected failure, the rebellion loses its voice, pride gets exposed, and true authority stands firm. But make no mistake, carrying God's authority isn't about status. It's about service. It's about accountability. It's about living in a way that reflects His power, His order, and His purpose. Aaron didn't walk away from that moment celebrated. He walked away with greater responsibility, knowing the eyes of the nation were on him, knowing his authority came with a target, but also knowing God Himself backed him. And that's the confidence you need. Not arrogance, not insecurity. Confidence rooted in the reality that when God chooses you, when God confirms you, no rebellion, no critic, no opposition can undo what He's produced. But the story doesn't stop there. Because as powerful as the blooming staff was, it was just a glimpse, a foreshadowing of a greater priesthood, a deeper authority, a resurrection that would shake the foundations of death itself. We're going there next. Stay locked in, because what comes after this reshapes everything about life, death, and the ultimate authority that proves itself through the impossible. What happened with Aaron's staff wasn't a moment designed to impress the crowd for a few minutes and then be forgotten. God isn't in the business of temporary signs or emotional hype that fades with time. When He moves, when He reveals His hand, He establishes permanent reminders. Markers, physical evidence that stays long after the arguments have died down, long after the rebellion has been exposed, long after the emotions have cooled. And that's exactly what happened with the staff that blossomed. God didn't let that staff return to Aaron's personal collection or let it fade into the background. He commanded something specific: place the staff inside the Ark of the Covenant. That alone speaks volumes, and if you've been following this story closely, you'll understand how intentional that was. The Ark wasn't just a fancy box. It wasn't a religious artifact to be admired from a distance. It represented the very presence of God among His people. It was sacred, set apart, untouchable by ordinary standards. Inside the ark were three objects, each carrying deep meaning and impossible to ignore. First, the stone tablets, the law, written by the finger of God Himself. That wasn't symbolic. That was real, etched in stone, unchanging, a constant reminder of God's standard for His people. Second, the jar of manna, the supernatural provision God gave in the wilderness, a visible, lasting reminder that when the people had no food, no resources, no way to survive, God provided daily bread from heaven. And now, the third item, Aaron's staff, but not just any staff. The staff that had once been dead, stripped from its roots, declared lifeless by every logical standard, now transformed into undeniable proof of life, fruit, and God's authority. That staff didn't belong to Aaron anymore. It belonged to history. It belonged to the testimony of God's unshakable power to appoint, to defend, to bring life from death. Every time the people saw the ark, every time the leaders approached it, they were reminded God's authority isn't theoretical. It's visible. It produces results. It brings life from places no man can manipulate. And let's be real, men forget quickly. Doubts creep back in, pride resurfaces. The same crowd that witnessed the miracle could, over time, let their memories fade, let rebellion find a crack to crawl back in. That's human nature. But the staff inside the ark cut through that weakness. It was permanent, unchanging. The fruit may have dried, the flowers may have withered, but the memory, the evidence, remained. But here's the layer most people miss. By placing the staff in the ark, God wasn't just preserving a symbol. He was aligning that staff with His law and His provision, bringing together three realities that every man who claims to follow God has to face. The law, God's standard, His expectations, His holiness that doesn't bend for convenience. The manna, God's provision. His ability to sustain, to supply, to meet needs in impossible circumstances. The staff, God's authority. His right to choose, to confirm, to raise leaders, and to bring life where everyone else only sees death. Together, those three items inside the ark told the full story of how God governs his people, not through chaos, not through human competition, but through structure, provision, and undeniable evidence of his hand. For the people of Israel, every glance toward the ark was a confrontation with that reality. And for the men, especially, those who carried authority, who led families, who made decisions, it was a constant reminder. Your authority only stands if God has confirmed it. You lead under his law, by his provision, with his evidence backing you up. And let's be honest, that cuts deep, especially in a world where men are pressured to lead with image, performance, and self-made confidence. But God's model flips that. Authority that lasts comes from him, and when he confirms it, he backs it with fruit, real, visible results no one can deny. That's the power of the staff in the ark. It silenced future rebellions before they started. It answered pride before it found momentum. It reminded every leader, your position, your influence, your calling doesn't stand on your personality. It stands on God's confirmation. But here's where it gets uncomfortable for some. God preserved the staff as much for the faithful as he did for the rebellious. Because even after seeing miracles, people forget. Even after walking through open doors, some still question their worth, their authority, their right to carry the weight of leadership. That staff, preserved inside the ark, confronted those doubts. You may feel unqualified. You may feel overlooked. You may feel like the dead wood with no life left to offer. But if God's hand is on you, if his authority has touched your life, then life can still come from dead places. Aaron didn't earn that moment. He submitted to it. He obeyed. He laid his staff down with the others, fully trusting God to settle the matter. And God did, not just for a day, but for generations to remember. The Ark of the Covenant moved with the people, into battles, into the promised land, into sacred spaces of worship. And inside it, that same staff, the physical, lasting testimony that God brings life where death reigned, that his authority stands unshaken, no matter who questions it. That same principle echoes through your life right now. You may not carry a physical staff. You may not see your name written on an artifact inside a gold-plated ark. But the question remains, has God confirmed his hand on your life? Has he produced evidence, fruit, results that silences doubt? And if he has, don't shrink back. Don't second guess. Remember the staff. Remember the ark. Authority backed by God produces life, and life leaves no room for rebellion to breathe. But here's the bigger picture. the direction this story pushes us toward. That staff, preserved inside the ark, was a shadow of something greater, a high priest beyond Aaron, a covenant beyond the wilderness, a resurrection beyond a dead piece of wood. We're not done yet. Where this leads reveals the ultimate authority, the highest confirmation of life-conquering death. And it changes everything about how you lead, how you believe, and how you stand in a world full of noise, doubt, and rebellion. Stay with me, because what's coming next brings the whole story full circle. Everything about the story of Aaron's staff points to something bigger. It wasn't just about settling a rebellion or defending one man's leadership. That staff, blooming with life after being dead for so long, was never meant to be the final statement. It was a preview, a signpost, a glimpse of a greater eternal reality that would unfold thousands of years later, in a way that no one, not even the most faithful priests or the most rebellious leaders, could have predicted. Aaron's staff wasn't just about Aaron. It was always about pointing forward to a high priest far greater than Aaron ever was. And that's where this story grips your attention if you're really paying attention to the layers God weaves into history. Because what happened with that staff, a dead, lifeless object bursting with undeniable life overnight, foreshadows the greatest confirmation of authority the world has ever seen, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Stay with me, because this connection isn't poetic, it's intentional. Just like the rebellion questioned Aaron's authority, the world has always questioned Christ's authority. For centuries, people debated his identity, resisted his teachings, rejected his claim to divine authority. Even during his ministry on earth, the religious leaders, the very people entrusted with spiritual leadership, challenged him at every turn. "By what authority do you do these things?" they asked. It's the same spirit of rebellion that rose up against Moses and Aaron, now aimed squarely at Jesus. And here's the hook. Just like with Aaron, God doesn't respond to rebellion with debates. He responds with undeniable proof. Not with blooming almonds this time, but with an empty grave. Think about the parallel. Aaron's staff represented authority confirmed by life sprouting from death. Jesus, the ultimate high priest, confirmed his divine authority by doing the impossible, rising from the dead after 3 days in the tomb. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, a real physical resurrection witnessed by hundreds. The dead wood coming back to life was a sign. The dead man walking out of the grave, that was the fulfillment. And here's why this matters to every man watching, especially those who carry responsibility, those wrestling with doubts, those questioning the legitimacy of their own calling. The same God who confirmed Aaron's authority in the wilderness confirmed Christ's authority through resurrection, and that authority isn't temporary. It's not subject to human approval. It's eternal, unstoppable, and sealed by the highest evidence possible: victory over death itself. But the connection goes even deeper when you understand Christ's role as our eternal high priest. Under the Old Covenant, Aaron's priesthood was essential, but limited. His authority was bound to the sacrificial system, to rituals, to offerings that had to be repeated over and over because sin never truly stayed covered. But Jesus changed that. His priesthood isn't based on human lineage or temporary rituals. His priesthood is eternal, backed by a once-for-all sacrifice, confirmed by the empty tomb. He didn't just enter an earthly tabernacle, he entered heaven itself as our advocate, our mediator, our high priest who never dies, never fails, never has to be replaced. And the resurrection? That was God's public confirmation, the ultimate blooming staff that silenced every rebellious argument, every prideful accusation, every doubt about who carries real authority. It's why the early church didn't preach philosophy or self-improvement. They preached Christ crucified and risen, because the resurrection wasn't a religious idea. It was historical, physical, undeniable. Just like the staff blooming in the tabernacle, the empty tomb stands as evidence that God's authority is real, alive, and above human systems. But here's where it cuts deeper for us today. That same resurrection power, that same life from death authority, isn't locked in the past. Scripture says the same Spirit that raised Christ from the dead now lives in us. That means God still brings life where there's only death. He still produces undeniable fruit where everything looks finished. And He still confirms His calling, His authority, His hand on your life with real, visible, lasting evidence. Maybe your situation feels like dry, dead wood right now. Maybe your purpose feels stripped down, cut off, lifeless. But the resurrection and the staff remind us that God doesn't need favorable conditions to bring life. He creates life in impossible places, just to make it clear that the results belong to Him, not to us. The rebellion questioned Aaron's authority, and God answered with life. The world questioned Christ's authority, and God answered with resurrection. And today, when people question your purpose, your calling, your legitimacy, God still answers with evidence. Not manufactured, not manipulated, but fruit that grows in places everyone else declared dead. That's how authority works in God's kingdom. It's confirmed, not campaigned for. It's backed by results, not by reputation. And it's rooted in the unshakable, undeniable fact that Jesus, the ultimate high priest, lives, reigns, and leads with authority that no one can challenge. So if you've been doubting, questioning, wondering if God's really moving in your life, the story of Aaron's staff and the resurrection of Christ are your answer. Life comes from death. Fruit comes from barren places. Authority comes from God, and when He confirms it, no rebellion, no doubt, no circumstance can undo it. But don't check out yet, because we're not done. What this story builds toward next takes all of this, authority, life, calling, and applies it to your life in a way that's practical, personal, and impossible to ignore. Stay locked in, because what's coming next is where it all hits home. Here's where this story of Aaron's staff, the rebellion, and God's undeniable confirmation hits right where most men live, in the real, gritty, day-to-day moments where you wonder if God still shows evidence of His hand on your life. Because let's be honest, it's one thing to talk about miracles in the Bible, about blooming staffs, about the resurrection of Christ. But what about now? What about your life, your situation, your doubts? Does God still authenticate His chosen? Does He still produce life where there's only death? Does He still give signs that silence the noise, the questions, the rebellion that creeps into your own mind? The short answer, yes. And not only does He still do it, He does it with the same pattern, the same strategy, the same unmistakable proof that leaves no room for argument. God doesn't change His methods just because we live in a different generation. His character is consistent. His way of confirming His hand on your life hasn't shifted. What changed is that most people stopped paying attention to the signs that are already happening around them and inside them. If you've ever wondered, how do I know God's called me? How do I know I'm walking in His purpose? How do I know He's backing me when life feels dry, when the critics get loud, when I question myself? You're not alone. But here's the brutal truth most men don't want to admit. God always gives signs of life, but they don't always look the way you expect. We want fireworks. We want overnight success. We want dramatic, public, undeniable victories that shut every critic down instantly. But God works with process. He starts with small signs, buds before blossoms, blossoms before fruit. And that pattern, it's not weakness, it's intentional. Look back at Aaron's staff. It didn't jump straight to ripe almonds. The process started with buds, small, fragile signs of life that proved something was happening beneath the surface, even when it wasn't fully developed yet. That's exactly how God confirms His hand in your life. Some of you are in the bud season right now. You're seeing small signs, doors cracking open, opportunities showing up, small victories in places you thought were dead. And the temptation is to overlook it, to downplay it, to get frustrated that it's not happening faster. But buds are proof that life is present, that growth is coming, that God's already at work, even if the fruit isn't fully visible yet. Others of you are in the blossom season. There's beauty showing up. Things are shifting. People are noticing. But the fruit's not ready yet, and the waiting feels like pressure. You see potential, but the finish line feels distant. Again, that's God's process. Beauty before maturity, evidence before harvest. It's His way of building your character while He builds your calling. And some of you, you're holding ripe fruit right now. You're walking in results, seeing undeniable evidence that God's hand is on your life. But even then, the enemy whispers doubt. He plants rebellion in your mind, questions your authority, your position, your right to lead, to influence, to carry what God's entrusted to you. Here's the reminder from Aaron's staff and from Christ's resurrection. Fruit silences rebellion. Evidence shuts down pride. You don't have to defend your position when the results speak louder than words. You don't have to argue with critics when your life produces undeniable, visible signs of growth, health, influence, and transformation. But let me hit this from another angle, because a lot of men get discouraged when they expect signs of life in one area, but God's working somewhere else entirely. Maybe you're looking for fruit in your career, but God's producing growth in your character. Maybe you're chasing recognition in your ministry, but God's building endurance in your private life. Maybe you're praying for breakthrough in your finances, but God's producing patience, integrity, and discipline first. The point is, life doesn't always sprout where you want it first, but it always sprouts where God knows it needs to. And the proof? It always shows up. Maybe small at first, maybe hidden beneath the surface. But if God's hand is on you, if He's chosen you, if He's confirming His calling over your life, the evidence will come. The results will speak. And the critics? They'll have nothing left to say. But here's the challenge most men avoid. Fruit isn't just for public proof. It's for private accountability. When God confirms His hand on your life, it's not just to silence others, it's to remind you that your calling comes with responsibility. The buds, the blossoms, the almonds, they weren't just decorations. They were reminders that Aaron's authority wasn't about power. It was about service, about standing in the gap for the people, about carrying the weight of leadership with humility and obedience. And the same applies to you. Signs of life in your world, whether in your family, your influence, your purpose, aren't just to boost your confidence. They're God's way of saying, I've confirmed you. Now lead with integrity, serve with humility, walk with courage. Because rebellion isn't always external. Sometimes the rebellion creeps inside. Self-doubt, pride, fear, insecurity. And when that rebellion rises, the fastest way to shut it down is to look at the fruit, the proof. The undeniable signs that God's not done with you, that He's producing life where death tried to reign, that He's confirming His hand on your life in ways you can't deny. So here's the question every man has to wrestle with right now. Are you paying attention to the signs? Are you recognizing the buds, the blossoms, the fruit God's already producing in your life? Or are you so distracted by the noise, the critics, the rebellion in your own mind that you've missed the evidence staring you in the face? The story of Aaron's staff wasn't just about one miracle in the wilderness. It was a blueprint for how God operates in every generation, in every man's life, in every situation where His authority needs to be confirmed. And the resurrection of Christ? That's the ultimate, eternal confirmation. But God didn't stop working after the empty tomb. He's still confirming His hand, still producing fruit, still bringing life from dead places. And if you're watching closely, if you're honest enough to see it, the signs are everywhere. But don't check out yet. Because this story isn't finished. There's still one final question to wrestle with, the one that flips this whole narrative from history to personal, from ancient signs to the undeniable evidence God wants to produce in your life today. Stay with me, because what comes next brings the entire message full circle, right to your doorstep. Here's the question that's been building this entire time. The question that flips this ancient story from a history lesson to a personal challenge staring you straight in the face. The question that every man, every leader, every person watching needs to wrestle with before we end this. Was it a miracle, or was it a metaphor? Did Aaron's staff truly bloom overnight by the hand of God? Did dead wood really sprout life, produce flowers, and bear fruit in front of an entire nation? Or was it just a symbol, a metaphor crafted to teach a deeper truth about authority, life, and leadership? Let me tell you exactly how this works. The answer is both. That's what makes this story so powerful. It wasn't just a miracle to impress the crowd, and it wasn't just a metaphor to make people think. It was both, happening at the same time, layered with meaning, undeniable in reality, but carrying truth that goes beyond the physical evidence. That's how God operates. He moves in real time, in real history, with real evidence, but every act he performs carries a deeper layer designed to reach beyond the moment, to shape how we see him, how we see ourselves, and how we walk in this world. The staff that bloomed? Yes, it was a literal, physical miracle. Dry, dead wood sprouting life overnight. No question, no debate. Hundreds of thousands of people saw it. There was no sleight of hand, no hidden tricks. It happened exactly as Scripture records it, a raw, undeniable act of divine power proving once and for all that God chooses, God confirms, and God brings life where man only sees death. But at the same time, that miracle carried a message so much bigger than that one moment in Israel's wilderness. It was a metaphor, designed by God, pointing forward to an eternal reality that echoes through your life right now. The metaphor is simple but sharp. When God chooses someone, he produces signs of life, spiritual life, in places everyone else declared hopeless, dead, or finished. Authority isn't empty words. Leadership isn't self-proclaimed. Divine calling leaves evidence. That staff was the metaphor for how God works, how he silences rebellion, how he confirms his leaders, and how he brings undeniable growth where human logic says nothing can survive. And that brings us full circle to the ultimate fulfillment of this story. Jesus Christ, the true high priest, the better covenant, the resurrection that didn't just symbolize life after death, but proved it with the most undeniable miracle in history. His empty tomb wasn't just a symbol, it wasn't just metaphorical language designed to inspire followers. It was literal, historical, physical proof that God's authority triumphs over death, rebellion, and doubt. And yet, even that resurrection functions the same way, both miracle and metaphor. The miracle: Jesus, dead for 3 days, walked out of the grave in full view of witnesses, leaving no doubt about his divine authority. The metaphor? His resurrection points to the spiritual life God brings into every man, every situation, every heart that feels dead, dry, stripped of purpose. And now we land here. Your life, your leadership, your influence. Are there signs of life? Is there fruit where others only see dead wood? Are there buds, blossoms, and almonds sprouting in the impossible places of your story? Because that's how God still confirms his hand. It might not look like Aaron's staff physically blooming in a temple, but the signs are just as real. Peace in the middle of chaos. Growth in places everyone said were finished. Strength rising from weakness. Influence that you didn't manipulate your way into. And yes, fruit. Tangible, visible, undeniable evidence that God's hand is on your life. The rebellion, it still exists today. Pride creeping in, doubts whispering, critics questioning, even your own mind battling the legitimacy of your calling. But God still answers rebellion the same way, with life, with fruit, with growth that silences the noise, shuts down the opposition, and confirms His authority over your life. And maybe you're watching this thinking, I don't see that yet. My situation feels like the 11 dead staffs, dry, lifeless, stuck. But remember, growth starts small. Buds before blossoms, blossoms before fruit. God works in process, but when He starts, He finishes. And when He confirms His hand, no one, no rebellion, no critic, no circumstance can undo what He's doing. So was it a miracle or a metaphor? It was both, and both are still unfolding in Scripture, in history, in your life right now if you've got the eyes to see it. So here's the last thing I'll leave you with. Look for the signs. Pay attention to the buds, the small victories, the quiet moments of growth. Recognize the fruit, even if it's early, even if it's not complete, because those are God's way of saying, I'm still confirming you. I'm still bringing life where there was death. If this message hit you, if it opened your eyes to see your life, your leadership, your calling differently, do this. Hit the like button so this message spreads, and share it with someone else who's stuck, doubting, or ready to see God bring undeniable life where the world only sees dead wood. Stay sharp, stay grounded, and remember, God still brings life from dead places, and He's not done confirming His authority through your story.